Wyoming Territory, July 1877. The sun had barely crested the distant hills when Theodara O'Dell kicked off her boots and ran for her life. The morning dew clung to her hem as she tore across the pasture behind her family's house, the rough leather satchel slapping against her side. Her lungs burned, but she did not slow. Not when her father's voice bellowed her name from the porch. Not when the shotgun cracked over the corral gate. And not when she crossed the creek that marked the end of the O'Dell land and the beginning of whatever came next. She did not look back. The forced betrothal had been arranged in secret, as if she were a piece of cattle to be traded. A man 3 times her age, with dead eyes and scarred knuckles, had shaken her father's hand like it was already done. But Theodara, 21, stubborn, and raised on wind and wild, had made her choice before the ink dried on the marriage papers. By noon, the sun was high and relentless, and her legs ached from walking. She hid the worn satchel beneath her skirt and kept her hat low. The small town she passed through gave her little notice. Just another dusty girl passing through. She reached the base of the Wind River Range by dusk. There, nestled in the folds of the land, was a small ranch, weathered, quiet, and worn like it had seen its share of storms. A corral with 2 horses stood half-mended. A chicken limped across the yard. The house itself leaned slightly to the east, like it had grown tired of standing straight. She was about to move on when the screen door creaked open. A man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, a rifle resting easy in his grip. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, sweat darkening the fabric. He had a sun-browned face, a slow, steady look in his eyes, and a scar that crossed the bridge of his nose like it had been earned, not given. "You lost?" he asked. Theodara hesitated, then shook her head. "I need work. I can clean, fix fences, cook if I have to. Just need a place to stay." The man looked at her a long time. Not like he was judging, more like he was measuring the weight of her words. Finally, he nodded once. "Name's Quillan Vaughn. This place needs more than I got time for. You help, you stay. That's simple." She swallowed hard, heart still hammering from the morning. Theodara O'Dell. He nodded again, turned, and walked back inside without another word. She followed. That night, she lay on a cot in the corner of the parlor, the sound of fire crackling low in the hearth. The silence outside was thick, broken only by the occasional grunt of a horse or rustle of wind across the roof. Her muscles ached, her throat was dry, but for the first time in weeks, her heart slowed its pounding. Quillan did not ask questions. He gave her a list of chores at dawn, handed her a biscuit and black coffee, and rode out to tend his herd. She mended the chicken coop and patched the leaky roof. At supper, they ate in silence beans, bread, and boiled potatoes. He still said little, but his eyes held a quiet kind of attention when they met hers. Not hunger, not pity, just noticing. By the 3rd day, she noticed him too. He moved through the world like a man used to being alone, not bitter, just used to quiet. When he worked, he did it with his whole self, no wasted motion. He spoke to his animals like they were old friends, and he always left the last biscuit for her without saying a word. On the 5th morning, as she swept the porch, a sound echoed across the yard, a child's cry, sharp and short. She froze. Another cry followed, then a shout. Quillan came running from the barn, rifle already in his hands. "Stay back," he told her. She did not listen. They found the boy tangled in the barbed wire fence at the edge of the pasture, blood on his arm and dirt on his face. He could not have been more than 6. Tears streaked his cheeks, and his left hand clutched a torn scrap of fabric like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Quillan dropped his rifle and climbed the fence in 2 strides. Hey, easy now." The child flinched, but Quillan's voice was gentle. He untangled the boy carefully, lifting him like something precious. "You are all right? I have you." Theodara ran ahead to get water and bandages. When she returned, Quillan was cradling the boy on the porch, his arms steady around the small frame. The child's name was Darren. He had no shoes, no coat, and no idea where his parents had gone. Just said they left 2 nights ago and told him to wait. He had waited and then wandered and then fallen. "He is alone," Theodara said softly that night, watching Quillan as he tucked the boy into the cot she had been using. Quillan's jaw tensed. Not anymore. They made space. Darren stayed close to Theodara, his little hand often reaching for hers. She started humming when she cooked, something her mother used to do, and he smiled when he heard it. Quillan fixed the fence each morning now with Darren strapped to his back in a rag sling. Said the boy liked to see the land from high places. Theodara stitched a pair of trousers from old flour sacks, and when Darren wore them, he ran like he owned the whole world. Days turned to weeks. One late afternoon, Theodara stood ankle-deep in the creek, scrubbing shirts against a flat stone. Quillan walked down with a bucket in hand and paused beside her. "You never said what you were running from." She kept her eyes on the water. "A man. My father promised me to him. I did not want the life that came with that name." Quillan looked at her, not with surprise, just understanding. "You were safe here." She glanced up. "Am I?" He nodded once. "I would never let anyone take you from here." Her breath caught. That night, as she sat beside the fire with Darren asleep on her lap, Quillan poured 2 mugs of coffee, handed her one, and sat close enough their knees brushed. Neither spoke for a while. Then he said, "This place was never meant to be a home. I just kept it going because I did not know what else to do." She looked at him. "And now?" Quillan turned, his eyes steady. "Now, I think maybe it could be." Theodara felt something shift in her chest. She reached out and took his free hand. He did not let go. August settled in with dry heat and a stillness that wrapped around the ranch like an old wool blanket. Theodara rose earlier now, often before the birds, to beat the sun to the well or the stove. She'd taken to humming while she worked, low and soft, never the same tune twice. The sound seemed to soothe Darren when he woke from restless dreams, and Quillan had started pausing in the doorway when he heard her, like the music held something he hadn't quite figured out how to name. One morning, as she peeled potatoes out back by the wash basin, she noticed a length of rawhide hanging from the fence rail beside the barn. It hadn't been there the day before. Its ends were neatly braided, like someone had taken the time to shape it with care. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to look. Quillan leaned against the barn wall in the shade, sharpening his drawknife with slow, practiced strokes. A half-carved handle rested between his boots. He didn't turn when she approached. "That for me?" she asked, lifting the braided rawhide. He nodded without looking up. "Reins for your hands. Thought you might want to take Clover out sometime." Theodara hadn't touched a saddle since she'd crossed the creek. She traced the loops of the braid with her thumb. "I thought she was yours. She don't take to most folks. But she followed you fence side yesterday." Theodara smiled, the kind that built from the chest up. "She's got sense then." Quillan's mouth twitched, not quite a grin, more like a thought he didn't speak. "You'll need a proper seat. I'll fit the saddle this evening." She nodded. "I appreciate it." He looked up at last. "You're not just passing through anymore, are you?" Theodara stared at the braid in her hands. "No, that night, after Darren was tucked into the hayloft with a lantern and a book she'd found beneath the floorboards, Theodara stepped into the barn where Quillan worked by lamplight. He stood beside Clover's stall, cinching the saddle as the mare shifted her weight and snorted softly. Theodara leaned on the post. "He asked me today if we were married." Quillan didn't pause. "What did you tell him?" "That I wasn't. That you weren't either." He adjusted the stirrup, then met her eyes. "He'll ask again. Would it be wrong if one day I said yes?" The silence between them thickened, not heavy, but full. Quillan moved around the horse and stood beside her, his hands dusted with sweat and leather oil. "I don't want to take something from you just because you're running." "I'm not running anymore," she said, voice low. "I'm choosing." He reached toward her, slow enough that she could have stepped back. She didn't. His fingers brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, calloused and warm. "I'd wait," he said. "I already have," she whispered. A cricket chirped behind them, and Clover shook her mane. Quillan's hand fell away, but the closeness didn't. Later, when the house had gone silent and the wind picked up through the cottonwoods, Theodara stood at the back porch with a blanket over her shoulders. The stars were sharp and scattered, the sky wide enough to hold anything. Darren's voice came soft from the door behind her. "Are you my mama now?" She turned, crouched down. "No, sweetheart. But I can be someone who stays. He looked at her for a long time, then wrapped his arms around her neck. I like you more than the ones before. Her throat tightened. I like you too. He didn't let go for a while. By the next week, the ranch had a rhythm. Theodara took over the bookkeeping Quillan had always ignored, smoothing out debts with sacks of oats and jars of lard when coin ran short. She traded eggs for cloth at the dry goods store in Lander, rode Clover bareback to the edge of town, and never once looked over her shoulder. One afternoon, while she was boiling dye from onion skins, Quillan returned from the ridge with a cut across his arm. He waved it off as nothing, but the sight of blood made her chest clench. Sit, she ordered, fetching boiled water and a clean rag. He raised an eyebrow. You fixing to scold me? She didn't answer. She cleaned the wound in silence, her touch firm but careful. When she was done, she pressed the cloth into his hand. You don't get to brush things off anymore, she said, voice quiet but steady. Quillan looked at her like he was seeing something new. You talk like you belong here. She met his gaze. Because I do. He pulled her into him then, not sudden, but sure, like it had been waiting. His arms held her with the kind of strength that didn't ask anything in return. Her head fit beneath his chin, and for the first time in her life, she didn't need to guard her breathing. That evening, Darren lit the lamps without being asked. He set 3 places at the table and put a fistful of wildflowers beside Theodara's bowl. Quillan watched her across the table. You ever think about what comes next? She reached for Darren's small hand and held it between them. I think it's already here. He nodded, slow and certain. Then let's make it last. The chill came early that September, curling under door frames and slipping through the cracks between floorboards before the leaves had even begun to turn. Theodara stitched an extra lining into Darren's coat with thread she'd bartered for dark green. Coarse, but warm enough to hold off the wind that had started to whistle down from the high ridges. She worked by lamplight most evenings now, the glow softening the room where Quillan had built a second pallet for the boy near the hearth. One morning, she found Quillan bent over a broken axle near the shed, sleeves rolled, jaw tight. He looked up briefly when her shadow crossed his, then returned to the stubborn iron wheel. I meant to fix it a week ago, he muttered. Wagon won't hold much till it's set right. She squatted beside him and ran her fingers along the cracked wood. It's dry rotted clean through. You'll need a fresh beam. He exhaled through his nose. I'd have to haul one down from the pines. That's a day's ride. I can manage things here. He glanced at her, something unreadable in his face. Won't be back till after dark. I've got eyes, Quillan, and hands that work. He didn't argue again. She packed him a strip of bread wrapped in oilcloth and 2 boiled eggs. When he swung into the saddle, Darren chased after him with a pine cone and pressed it to Quillan's palm without a word. Quillan tucked it into his pocket like it was something sacred and touched the boy's shoulder before riding out. That day passed slower than most. Theodara kept Darren close while she mended the harness straps and boiled down the last of the tomatoes. He sat on the porch with his slate board, tongue poked out as he copied the letters she'd drawn for him that morning. Late in the afternoon, he brought her a crooked E with the lines all backward and his face wearing the solemn pride of a king. She kissed the top of his head and didn't mention the mistake. When dusk settled in and Quillan hadn't returned, she lit the lantern early and hung it in the window. The wind had picked up by then, dry and sharp, stirring dust along the yard. Darren had fallen asleep in the crook of her arm, one hand still curled in her apron. The knock came just after nightfall. Not the door wooden. Not urgent measured. She laid Darren on the blanket and eased the rifle from the hooks beside the hearth. Theodara opened the door slowly, barrel low but ready. A man stood there, narrow-hipped, with a red kerchief at his neck and boots scuffed from hard riding. He tipped his hat. Ma'am, I don't mean trouble. You've found a quiet place, she said, not lowering the rifle. I'm looking for Quillan Vaughn. She didn't blink. Why? We rode together during the war. I owe him more than most. She studied him. His face was lined but kind. with a look in his eyes like he'd spent a long time trying to remember how to rest. "You wait here," she said. "He's not back yet." The man nodded once and stepped back into the dark. Quillan returned near midnight, shoulders stiff, a fresh welt blooming above his brow. Theodara opened the door before he could knock. "Bandits on the trail," he said simply. "Didn't take anything. Just made their point. They'll come again? Maybe." She stepped aside to let him in. The man from earlier stood from the hearth, where he'd waited in silence. Quillan froze when he saw him. "Denton," he said, voice flat. "Didn't come to collect," the man replied. "Just heard you were still breathing." Quillan didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. "You always had a way of finding the places no one else could." Denton's eyes flicked to Theodara. "You've got someone now." Quillan glanced toward her, then back. "I do." Denton nodded. "That's good. You deserved it." Theodara stepped closer. "He needs sleep." "We all do." Denton left before first light. No questions, no promises. Just a long look at Quillan, and a quiet "be well" before he rode east. Quillan didn't speak of it again. By the end of that week, Theodara had cleared the root cellar of the last spoiled jars and filled it with dried beans and salt pork. She taught Darren how to knead dough, his small fists punching the flour with fierce delight. That night, as they shared the first loaf, Quillan leaned back in his chair and looked at her with something softer than a smile, something steadier. "I never figured I'd find peace with anyone," he said, voice low. "Didn't think I had much left to give." She reached across the table and took his hand. "You've given us more than you know." His fingers curled around hers. Outside, the wind had begun to settle. The lantern flickered once, then held steady. By early October, frost began to silver the edges of the fields, and the cottonwoods along the creek thinned their leaves until the branches looked like bones reaching skyward. Theodara hung quilts over the windows at night and started keeping the fire lit through dawn. When the cold took hold of the earth, it didn't let go easy. One morning, Quillan returned from the eastern ridge with a bundle slung over his saddle and mud crusted to the hem of his trousers. He laid the wrapped bundle on the kitchen table while Darren traced patterns on the frosted glass with his thumb. Theodara peeled back the burlap. "Where'd you find these?" "Old widow east of the valley passed on last spring. Her boys selling off her things. Said she was a weaver." Inside were yards of thick hand-loomed cloth, the kind that held warmth near the skin. Red and ochre threads wove patterns of wheat and stone. Theodara ran her fingers along the edge, then folded one square aside. "She wove her initials into the corners," she said. "CS. Cora Stanley. She used to sing in Lander's chapel." "You knew her?" "I was 12 when she gave me a peppermint from her pocket and told me not to marry a man whose boots never showed wear. I never forgot that." Quillan's mouth tugged faintly. "You didn't." That evening, Theodara cut the cloth and hemmed a winter coat for Darren. She padded the shoulders with leftover wool and lined the pockets in soft muslin. When she held it up for measuring, the boy stood still as a fence post, arms straight out, eyes wide. "You'll wear this for the first snow," she told him. "Will you wear one too?" he asked. She glanced toward Quillan, who was oiling the hinges on the door. "I'll have mine ready." Later, after Darren had fallen asleep beneath 2 quilts stitched with stars, Quillan joined her at the table where she traced measurements on a square of hide. "I've been thinking," he said, voice lower than usual. "We ought to make it official." She put down the stylus. "You mean, I want you here for good? Not just staying, not just helping." She didn't speak right away. Her hands folded in her lap, still chilled from the workroom. "Doesn't need a preacher," he continued. "Not unless you want one. Just our word, and a place to build a life that's ours." She lifted her gaze to his. "I never thought I'd get to choose, but I choose this. I choose you." They didn't need to say more. He reached across the table, and she set her hand in his. The next morning, They rode to the edge of the south pasture before breakfast. The grass there had yellowed into brittle stalks, and a stand of fir trees edged the horizon in a dark line. Quillan stopped near an outcropping of stone and dismounted. He swung down a leather satchel and unwrapped a small box carved from pine. "This was my mother's," he said simply. Inside were 2 plain bands. No shine, no polish, just honest silver, worn smooth by years and hands. Theodara took one and turned it in her fingers. "Are you sure?" He nodded. She slid it on his hand, and he did the same to hers. No vows, no ceremony, just the sound of wind through pine and the low breath of horses nearby. They stood quiet for a long time, watching the sun rise through the trees. He touched her cheek with the side of his knuckle, and when she leaned into his hand, he kissed her without hesitation. There was no urgency in it, just the weight of something settled, something true. When they returned, Darren sat on the porch with 2 wooden figures he'd carved from scrap wood, one missing an arm, the other with a crooked hat. "I made 'em for you," he said. "So you don't forget." "We won't," Theodara said, lifting him into her arms. "Not ever." That night, they shared cornbread and beans sweetened with molasses, and Quillan pulled a fiddle from an old trunk she hadn't known he kept. The sound was rough, the strings needing tuning, but the notes came through clear, slow, and steady. Theodara hummed along, and Darren clapped in time with the rhythm. Long after the lamp had burned low and the fire had turned to coals, she stood at the doorway watching the sky. The stars were sharp as flint, and the land stretched wide and quiet beneath them. Quillan wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting against her shoulder. "You cold?" he asked. She leaned back into him. Not anymore. And she wasn't. Not now. Not with this man, this boy, this place shaped by their hands and held together by choice. The land still had its hardness. The wind still carried bite. But inside these walls, there was warmth earned, kept, and never again taken for granted. By mid-November, the ground had hardened, and the wind came down from the mountains with a sharper edge. Theodara kept the root cellar stocked with dried apples, split peas, and 2 crocks of preserved venison stew she'd sealed herself. Mornings began with the crack of ice in the water bucket and ended with the hiss of logs settling into ash. Darren had taken to curling up beside the hearth with a pine needle broom, sweeping up bits of hay by dusk as if it were his sworn duty. One afternoon, while Quillan repaired the west fence line, Theodara knelt beneath the porch to retrieve a spool of wool rope she'd stored in a sealed crate. Her hand brushed against something caught between the joists, a wooden box, no bigger than her palm, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a brittle leather strap. It had likely fallen through the floorboards years before. She brought it into the kitchen and set it on the table, the knot in the strap stiff with age. Quillan came in just after, brushing dirt from his knees. She glanced up, found something wedged under the porch. He eyed the box, then sat. "Let's have a look." Inside were 3 objects, a tin brooch shaped like a swallow, a folded page torn from a journal, and a yellowed packet labeled in a woman's hand, "Pennyroyal Seeds for Spring." Theodara turned the brooch over in her fingers. Whoever left this meant to come back. Quillan reached for the page. The ink was faded, but still legible. "May the land be kinder to the next soul who calls this place home." She set the trinkets gently back inside. "Then maybe it's our turn to be kind to it." He looked at her a long moment. "You want to plant them, come thaw?" "I do." That night, as snow began to whisper against the windows, Theodara sat with her sewing in her lap, listening to the rise and fall of Quillan's voice as he read to Darren from a worn book of prairie tales. The fire cast soft shadows on the walls, and the boy leaned against Quillan's side, lips moving silently along with the words. When Darren finally nodded off, Theodara rose and took the book from Quillan's hands, setting it gently aside. "He's starting to read them himself," she said. Quillan nodded. "He's got your steadiness." She tilted her head. "He's got your quiet." Quillan reached for her hand. And he's got both of us now. The next morning, Theodara found a folded scrap on her side of the bed. Quillan's handwriting, careful, deliberate read only, "Meet me at the cedar grove after breakfast." She dressed in her thickest shawl and boots and left Darren with a biscuit and the instruction to keep the fire going and not open the door to anyone but them. The boy saluted solemnly and returned to his slate letters. The cedar grove stood a quarter-mile south, half shielded by a rise in the land. The trees there grew close together, and the snow hadn't yet settled on the ground beneath. Quillan waited at the center, his breath clouding in the cold, a bundle wrapped in canvas at his feet. She stepped in, brushing a branch aside. "You planning to build something out here?" He lifted the bundle and unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a small cradle, hand-carved, the wood smooth and pale as bone. The joints were joined with pegs, not nails, and 2 cedar branches formed the legs, their bark sanded clean. He didn't speak, just set it gently on the ground between them. Theodara stepped closer, her eyes wide. "I started it before the frost came in," he said. "Didn't know if I should show you yet." She touched the curve of the rocker. "You think we'll need it?" "I do." Her breath caught, not from the cold. "I haven't had. I didn't know for sure." She placed a hand over her stomach, then looked up at him. "But I hoped." His face softened in a way she hadn't seen before. "Then we'll be ready." She knelt beside the cradle, ran her hand over the smoothed edge. "This child, they'll be raised with more than I ever had, and never less than they deserve." When she stood, he pulled her into his arms, held her until her breath returned to even. The trees above them creaked in the wind, but the space between them stayed warm. Winter settled deep. Snow came heavy the week before the solstice, blanketing the barn roof and muting the world to a hush. Theodara took comfort in the rhythm of Quillan's boots thudding across the floor each morning, Darren's laughter when he learned to catch snowflakes on his tongue, the rise and fall of the wind outside while she stitched a new bonnet from old muslin scraps. Quillan built a second bed frame in the main room, this one smaller, with rounded corners and pegs for a quilt she hadn't yet finished. Darren helped stain the wood, his small hands careful under Quillan's guidance. By January, the cradle had been moved inside, set near the hearth where the fire would reach it. Theodara filled it with a blanket she'd spun herself, dyed with onion skin and edged in blue thread. One evening, as the wind howled high and distant, Theodara sat with her feet tucked under her, her body heavy with the child growing inside her. Quillan placed a mug of warm cider in her hands and sat beside her on the floor, their backs to the stove. "You ever think about what you would have done if you hadn't come here?" he asked. She shook her head. "That life's behind me. This one's the only one that counts." Darren padded out from the small room they'd turned into his, dragging a quilt. He curled up between them without asking and laid his head on her lap. "I want to be a blacksmith," he said sleepily. "You've got the hands for it," Quillan said. "And I want a sister, not a brother. Sisters don't throw things." Theodara chuckled. "We'll see what the good Lord sends." "Tell him I'm serious," Darren mumbled before falling asleep. Quillan kissed her knuckles, then rested his forehead against hers. "You gave me a life I never knew I wanted." She touched the line of his jaw. "You gave me a place to belong." Outside, the moon climbed high behind the clouds and the snow kept falling, quiet and steady as breath. Come spring, the pennyroyal bloomed in a small patch near the barn. Theodara planted a garden beside it, beans, onions, and late corn, and Darren helped pat the soil around each seed. When the baby came, the labor was long but steady, and Quillan never left her side. At dawn, she held a daughter with dark hair and strong lungs, wrapped in the same swallow-stitched quilt she'd made for the cradle. They named her Cora. Darren held her with both arms and whispered, "I'll show her how to read." That summer, the ranch grew full. Neighbors came by with bread and cloth, and someone left a basket of wildflowers on the porch without a note. Quillan added another stall to the barn, and Theodara started teaching Darren his numbers with the help of a chalkboard she'd rigged from an old window pane. One evening, As they sat watching the sun dip behind the ridge, Quillan rested his hand on her knee. "You ever think we'll leave this place?" She looked out over the pasture, where the mare grazed and Darren ran barefoot chasing his own shadow. "No," she said, "not ever." He nodded, as if he'd known her answer before he asked. And as dusk settled in, with the baby asleep on her shoulder and the man she loved beside her, Theodara knew she'd outrun every shadow that had once chased her. Nothing waited behind now, only what they'd built ahead, day by day, hand in hand. Their story, quiet and strong, would hold. And it did.